It's my pleasure to welcome today Dr. Katarina Peixoto. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Philosophy Department of the State University of Rio de Janeiro, UERJ, in Brazil. Her main areas of research are the behavior of singular terms in the logic of Port Royal, the nature of the mind, the notion of mental activity, the epistemic implications and practices of rationalism, the conceptual boundaries between representation and judgment, and the methods in the recovery of women in the history of modern philosophy. So we'll be hearing something about this area of her research today. She's the co-organizer of the first international conference, Women in Modern Philosophy, which took place last year in Rio de Janeiro. And she has also worked as a journalist, as an editor and translator, and she was a consultant for the United Nations Development Program, UNPD. Katarina, many thanks for sharing your expertise with us today. We are very grateful to have you here with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much. I will try to talk slowly due to my accent, and I ask you to bear with me regarding my accent, not my work. So
accent, beautiful. I love it.
Thank you. And I will go directed to my point because I talk too much, and this is a first result of recent research. So I'm quite curious to do this dive in Châtelet thought. So I will straightforward to my presentation. Here it is. This is the structure. Now begin to point 1, searching Du Châtelet. What I mean by searching Du Châtelet, her place in Enlightenment is established, as well as in the history of 18th century. In the history of mechanicism, her translation of Newton's Principia, which is ultimately means its introduction to the European continent, as well as her work of maturity, Foundations of Physics, illuminates not only its studies in the history of ideas, but conceptual history in the strict sense. She is a rationalist metaphysician willing to provide an analytical solution, that is a mathematical one, to the challenges that Newton had left open, according to her. The search for an exhaustive explanation of universal gravity depends on her peculiar and radical use of hypotheses in the foundations of physics. And even more promising, the studies of recovery and analysis of the legacy of this woman philosopher are not even 2 decades old, which means that there is a lot to be explored. However, the mere outskirts of the philosophy canon, this is outskirts, is an expression I'm borrowing from Sandrine Berger. This condition of outskirts is there. Du Châtelet is supposed to be studied as some philosophical thought and figure between Leibniz and Newton, or through the dialogue between Clarke and Leibniz, or in her refusal of Lockean approach to ideas and minds, or in her difference before Cartesian theory of hypothesis in her approach to vis viva in Leibniz. As the archives in St. Petersburg, the Voltaire archives, are not accessed in a broad and unrestricted manner, and as research continues, the outskirts position, which can only be accessed via mirroring canon figures, tends to be nuanced. Then, Émilie Du Châtelet philosophy will be established in her legacy analysis and her legacy analyzed from her own philosophical work. Du Châtelet wrote about the propagation of fire, about the interpretation of Bible, about the function of the hypothesis in the demonstration of science, about universal gravitation, and had a radical approach of ontological principles. In each of these works, she seems to make clear, I have been studying that for less than a year, so bear with me, two tenets that seem to me of method. The priority of ontology in explaining nature, that is to say, one, the priority of being over knowledge and explanation, or the demonstration of science, and two, a radical universalism. This ontological priority may seem trivial, but it's not. Du Châtelet does not offer a doctrine of substance, nor even have a theory of ideas or representation. To understand the extent of what is to be taken as an ontological priority, we'll need to understand that her use of the principle of contradiction and sufficient reason, influenced by Wolff and Leibniz, is ontological, or has an unambiguously strict ontological claim. That is, they are not taken as laws of thought, but of nature. In this talk, however, I intend to analyze point 2, her radical universalism. I will do that from an unpublished study, which I have only been granted access through Fragments. Her first exercise, her first philosophical exercise on literature, and I intend to make clear below the first singular and authorial expression of her philosophical thought. It is curious that she found in the translation activity, a task commonly attributed to literate women in the early modern period of republics of letters in Europe, a way to express and eventually develop her own philosophical reflections without these being comments or uses of concepts of other philosophers. More than curious, it's remarkable, something like the perfect cover for the uncompromising exercise of rationality as a principle and as a value of sociability. For Du Châtelet does not actually make a translation, but a détournement, a semantic maneuver that before the mechanical printing of text, the industry of that, was quite common in France and in Germany, with the names parsimonious translations or free translations or literary translations. The semantic maneuver can be done in many ways, and détournement seems to be one of the most radical ones. It's a question of inverting by deviations the meaning of what is said, in most cases with the same grammatical structure of sentence utterance by substituting subjects, adverbs, and predicates. So here is what I'm meaning, what I mean with détournement. I'm borrowing the French word détournement from the French situationists, who named it in the 16th of last century, possibly to recover an anachronistic practice of reviving and transforming the state of affair through the transformation of meanings and significations, of senses and references of texts, which should, because it could, be fixed in different pragmatic contexts. I mean, there is something revolutionary in using détournement, something revolutionary in the sense of subversive. As I'll try to make clear below, what Du Châtelet does with Mandeville is nothing less than a subversion of the main thesis of the text would have, should she have actually translated it. In the end, we will see that Du Châtelet can be found not only in her theory of translation, presented in the preface to the Détournement of the Fable of the Bees. Her thinking is presented in the statements, which perhaps could lead us to concepts of sociability, affective rationality, morality, and education, unveiled in the semantic maneuvers to which she proceeds, using the satirical text of the Dutch physician without irony and without defending the thesis that private vices would bring public benefits. The subtitle of the original text is Private Vices, Public Benefits. Du Châtelet Détournement is so irreducible, I'll try to show, that it can be taken as an inversion of Mandeville's thesis, private virtues, public virtues. The universalism of the Enlightenment is then revealed in its splendor in the mind of a philosopher Marquise. So I'll talk about her fable. Mandeville's comment translation, as literature calls it, of the Fable of the Bees has not been published. According to Judith Zinter, there are 4 drafts, the later being the basis for this presentation. The originals are still in St. Petersburg Voltaire Archive. The preface, the structure of the translation, and some passages I will tend to analyze below provide an overview of examples of what I call Du Châtelet's radical universalism. In the preface, she presents a small theory of translation on which her choices and decisions are based. Also in the preface, she will find the key to take the Détournement seriously as a reflected philosophical decision to express her thought. First, she claims that translators are entrepreneurs of the Republic of Letters. And as Zinter diagnoses, these notions of entrepreneur is associated with the figure of exotic product dealers. I was kind of making jokes during my Canva composition with Du Châtelet with some mangoes in her mind, but I drop out, of course. Immediately afterwards, Du Châtelet seemed to treat translations as limited, lesser activity, one of crossing products which would lack genius and the less worth of glory than authorial work. Then she says, she establishes this distinction between discursive thought and imaginative thought. Excuse me. Of all works, I'm quoting her, of all works, those of discursive thought seem to me the most susceptible to a good translation. Reason and morals know no country. The genius of a language, the curse of translators, is less to be felt in works where ideas are the only things to be conveyed, and where the graces of style are not the main merit. By contrast, works of imagination can rarely be transmitted from people to people, because to translate a good poet, one must be almost as good poet as the author. End of quotation. She distinguished between discursive and imaginative thinking. The philosophical translation would be the one made by Pierre Coste of Locke's essays, for example, whereas the translations of imaginative thinking would be more difficult. They would offer identifications requirement between translations and the object of translation, and also between contexts. Therefore, we may perhaps infer that philosophical translations are in fact appropriate for the exchange of ideas, whereas imaginative translations would be like objects of art, identity representations of expressions and people in a most particular, not in a universal sense, perhaps. Du Châtelet makes this distinction then, once again, disdain translation activity. And once again, this translation activity, which over time would be at best, according to her, a very mediocre job. Translation would be a job that would have remained for educated women, since they are unfairly hampered in assessing the education and training provided to men. Du Châtelet cannot be considered an avant-la-lettre feminist, nor does she seem uncomfortable with her social status and the responsibilities attached to it, as is the case, for example, for Elizabeth of Bohemia. The tone of her remarks in the preface, denouncing prejudice against women and defending universal access to education, precede the realization that she had become a thinking creature. It's in her words. And it is in this condition that she chose to translate the Fable of the Bees. Should have discovered too late that she would be able to do philosophy, so should be, I quoted her, content to render with clarity the truths others have discovered and which the diversity of languages renders useless for most readers, end of quotation. She would thus proceed to a philosophical translation according to her own criteria. That's what I'm bet here. Despite considering the Fable of the Bees the best book of ethics ever writing, she had said at the end of the preface, she informs, however, that she does not idolize the author of any other translators and announces her editorial decisions. This is one of her editorial decisions. I acknowledge that this work is written badly enough in English. I mean, this was the best work in ethics. This is so Du Châtelet. I acknowledge that this work is written badly enough in English. Parts of it are too long. And it sometimes goes too far, as when it says, for example, that a thief is useful to society as a bishop who gives alms. Mandeville is very funny, and that there is no merit in saving from a fire an infant about to be engulfed. In many other places, it advances several things which are not true and could be dangerous. I have taken care to add a corrective statement in those places in order to prevent them from having dangerous consequences. I have taken the liberty of pruning the author's style in a number of cases and cutting out all that was directed to the English in which they referred to specifically to their customs. End of quotation. So the book has enough problems in English. It has exceedingly long parts and sometimes rampant, and in several parts, it makes statements that are not true and are dangerous. She added corrections and pruned the author's style. In addition to, as stated below, Du Châtelet added her own reflections. I quote, "When the material on which I was working suggested then to me reflections that I believe it deserves to be included, I did it. However, as she affirms soon after, I'm quoting her, in order that the reader could discern them, I have taken care to indicate them with quotation marks." End of quotation. As Sincere puts in a note of disclaim, French translators of the 18th centuries often made additions, but Du Châtelet is unusual in her desire to set them apart in this way. End quotation. In fact, this is what I'm saying here. In fact, what she does is unusual in many aspects, among others, in the fact that this quotation didn't go the same way she anticipated. She just didn't make it exactly. She just made a détournement. I intend to analyze some cases as a method of explaining thoughts contrary to what is established in the original material. I will analyze some cases of her Détournement move. To begin with, Du Châtelet does not translate the entire book, but some parts. Following a bit Felicia Gottman's suggestions, her contributions to the original text can be divided in three categories. First are the obvious changes. additions and disagreements which are clearly indicated by quotations marks presented as footnotes. This can be subdivided in those that change or contradict it. Second, are those changes not made explicit by any form of quotations marks or parentheses, a détournement, or through their placing in a footnote. Again, they can be subdivided in the same two classes. The third, the paratextual elements that have no bearing in the original, this being the preface and those footnotes that serve the sole purpose to explain points of language or custom that might be unfamiliar to the French reader. End of quotation. Also, according to Gottman, Du Châtelet suppressed the sarcasm and toning down the caustic character of Mandeville original in such a way as to change the trust of the text. This is an expression from Gottman. Du Châtelet offered her own fable in the words of Sincer. I quote Sincer, her own work of morality, reflecting her privileged aristocratic French world, not his Anglo-Dutch dissenting mercantile perspective. End quotation. In what follows, I intend to show that the changes made along with her own work allow us to identify more than a mere expression of an aristocrat view, sometimes concerned with censorship in France. Sincer affirms that it is possible that Du Châtelet misses much of the irony, but from her own writings, it's evident that she preferred the straightforward, didactic prose. I'm not aligned with this. We should be attentive enough to observe in what follows what is intuitive to take serious, what that is intuitive to take seriously the philosophical thought expressed through her semantic maneuvers, or simply détournement. Here on the main objective of the fable, Mandeville writes, For the main design of the fable is to shield the impossibility of enjoy all the most elegant comforts of life that are to be met with in an industrial, wealth, and powerful nation. And at the same time, the blessed would be with all the virtue and innocence that can be wished for in a golden age. From thence to expose the unreasonableness and folly of those that desirous of being an opulent and flourishing people, and wonderfully greedy after all the benefits that they can receive as such, yet are always murmuring and exclaiming against those vices and inconvenience that from the beginning of the world is to present day have been inseparable from all kingdoms and states that everywhere farmed for strength, riches, and politeness at the same time. Now, what Châtelet does with that? She says, she translates, the main objective was to show how much the ignorance and the virtues of the so-called Golden Age are incompatible with the wealth and power of a great state, and to demonstrate the inconsequence of those who feel extreme pleasure with the comforts of life and all the other advantages that cannot be enjoyed if not in a powerful state. They never cease to speak out against the inconveniences that are inseparable. I won't read it in French, I don't think it's necessary, so let's go to the analysis of the first part of this quotation. Where Mandeville says, for the main design of the fable is to shield the impossibility of enjoying all the most elegant comforts of life that are to be met with an industrial, wealthy and powerful nations, and at the same time, he be blessed with all the virtue and innocence that can't be wished for in a golden age, Du Châtelet translates as, the main objective was to show how much the ignorance and the virtues of the so-called golden age are incompatible with the wealth and power of a great state. Where's the difference? Is Mandeville's statement translated correctly? Whereas Mandeville is saying that it is impossible to enjoy a wealthy life in a wealthy and powerful nation while being virtuous and innocent, Du Châtelet is saying another thing. Her statement is that ignorance and virtues of golden age are incompatible with the wealth and power of great state. While Mandeville refers to innocence, she refers to ignorance. Furthermore, she doesn't use the expressions most elegant comforts, but chooses the reference to the wealth and power of a great state. I'm not sure if her reference here is to a sort of intellectual elite or state as a general view of states. I mean, a society of classes, ancien régime. As Gottman puts it, I quote, in Mandeville's version, we can already detect how this kind of society is built up on the passions. Men are both desirous and wonderfully greedy, while the concept of pleasure as such plays a minor role. Enjoyment in Du Châtelet, a minor role in Mandeville's quotations. By contrast, Du Châtelet's emphasis is not on the passions, but on pleasure. Greed and desire have no place in her version. Instead, the notions of pleasure and enjoyment is considerably strengthened. As I read it, it's end of quotation, as I read it, Du Châtelet is not only toning down Mandeville conceptions, but actually reversing its meaning. Where he affirms the importance of greed, she affirms the importance of not being ignorant and not maintaining virtues which are incompatible with the new state of affairs. Let's go to the analysis of the other part of the quotation. Mandeville says, from thence to expose the unreasonableness of folly of those that desirous of being an opulent and flourishing people and wonderfully greed after all the benefits they can receive as such, are yet always murmuring and exclaiming against those vices and inconveniences that from the beginning of the world to this present day have been inseparable from all kingdoms and states and everywhere farmed for strange riches and politeness at the same time. Du Châtelet says, and to demonstrate the inconsequence of those who feel extreme pleasure with the comforts of life and all the other advantages that cannot be enjoyed if not in a powerful state. They never cease to speak out against the inconveniences that are inseparable. While Mandeville seems to describe in a complimenting tone, he used the expression wonderfully greedy, Du Châtelet completely changed the meaning, saying that she seeks to demonstrate the inconsequence. Where he states an incompatibility at the service of demonstrating the value of greed and moral vices, she condemns the inconsequence of those who act against what should be expected from a powerful state. Can it be said that we are analyzing a translation? My answer is no. And more strongly, it cannot be said that Du Châtelet is doing out of prudence in the face of censorship by the King of France. Other passage now. Mandeville says in the Fable, I believe men, besides skin, flesh, bones, etc., are obvious to the eye, to be a compound of various passions, that all of them, as they are provoked and come uppermost, govern him by turns, whether he will or no. Du Châtelet translation of this passage goes like this. Our soul is composed of different passions, as our bodies are endowed with bones, muscles, etc. These passions govern us in turn and are the source of our virtues and vices. Now, another passage. Because it was really obvious what she was doing in the last passage. For Mandeville, men are passion-driven, while for Du Châtelet, passions are sources of virtue and vices. She added not only a word, but a normative sense missing from Mandeville's caustic description of human nature. As Gottman states, I quote, perhaps the most important change is the omission. Whether he will or not, she does not seem to subscribe fully to Mandeville's determinism. I think it's more than that. She preserves rationality. So another part. On pride and shame. Mandeville writes, remark C, these two passions, pride and shame, in which the seeds of most virtues are contained, are realities in our frame and not imaginary qualities, are demonstrated from the plain and different effects that, in spite of our reason, are produced in us as soon as we are affected. Du Châtelet translation, the shame and the pride both are sources of our virtues, and not some imaginary qualities, but necessary ingredients of our complexion. I translated composé with complexion. I'm not sure if this is the right expression. Nothing proves it better than the different effects they produce in us in spite of ourselves. Analysis. Here, the most important element is the choice she makes to preserve the rationality of the virtues in the opposite direction to what Mandeville says. There are other fragments that support the hypothesis of Détournement in its proper sense, carried out by Châtelet, but there are already some clues which are eloquent enough, as I judge, to allow us some conclusions, albeit provisional ones. What does this analysis allows us to infer regarding Du Châtelet's philosophical mind? The exhaustive study of Du Châtelet's work on Mandeville is still to be done, and it seems promising enough to be carried out. In addition to not having access to the whole way to work, I choose to analyze fragments because in the work of recovering women philosophers in history, often what we have as material are nothing but fragments, remains of a legacy obscured by historiography or by contest. We do not have a philosophical Atlantis or an El Dorado of ideas and arguments. Most of the time, and rightly so, after all, misogyny is not just in narrative, but in history. Émilie Du Châtelet, however, was more recognized in life than by historiography. And this is an advantage that deserves to be explored. I mean, there is a lot to be researched. However, the analysis of the fragments proposed above already allow us, hopefully, to draw some conclusions and to raise new questions about the thinking of this philosopher. That is what I will propose as provisional conclusions. In the luxury debate, which is one of the most important moral discussions of the first decades of the 18th century, Du Châtelet does not subscribe to Mandeville's defense of the immorality of luxury as a virtue, and not only to tone down his caustic mood. On the contrary, she bets in her Détournement on enlightenment against ignorance, at the time when she seems to attribute innocence to ignorance as something incompatible with wealthy states. In the treatment of human nature, Du Châtelet does not subscribe to the defense that man being passion-driven by nature would be a solely virtuous condition. She adds the vices to the passionate nature, and going further, she claims that the origin of the virtue of the passions is has the same origin of its vices. Therefore, passions seem to be closer to vices than to virtues, according to her. Finally, as for shame and pride, Du Châtelet takes them as sources of virtues, but not in spite of our rationality, as Mandeville does. So, as an analytical exercise without historiographical pretensions, in fact, until St. Petersburg archives are fully examined, this is not possible in a satisfactory way, we can say that there is relevant philosophical material for analysis which allows some preliminary statements regarding the nature of Émilie Du Châtelet philosophical thought. Ignorance must be replaced by enlightenment in wealthy societies. Passions are sources of virtue and vice, and in the same vein, shame and pride must be measured by rationality and not in spite of it. If these theses are authorized conclusions from the visit I proposed to the passages above, then Du Châtelet Détournement can be read as a philosophical expression of its own, and furthermore, as a more evident expression than that available in her work in the philosophy of nature. There are passages that I did not use to analyze, in which I have access to, such as the conceptions of utilitarianism in both Mandeville and in Du Châtelet, in which a somewhat surprising alignment with Mandeville can be met. As is known, the original text of the fable conveys a critique of what the author, Bernard Mandeville, takes as the moralist of Jansenists like Fenelon. Denouncing hypocrisy, the Dutch satire Exile in England offers as a subtitle of his text the following statement: private vices, public benefits, implying that the well-being should be taken as a consequence of private vices and not, as moralists would hypocritically claim, as a result of virtue exercised in the field of private relations. An opposite version of the subtitle by her should then be this: private virtues, public benefits. However, and in spite of Du Châtelet having made observations that allow the inference of her adhesion to utilitarian positions in the social sphere, this would not be an adequate translation. Du Châtelet was not concerned with hypocrisy. La Rochefoucauld-Boutade, that reads, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, does not belong to an aristocrat universe, in which equality between citizens is not presupposed. To say the basic, there is no such concept as citizenship in the first place. However, at the end of the preface, she states her awareness that her readers will be members of the Republic of Letters. Preface, page 50. Du Châtelet has as readers of her Détournement only de facto equals, that is to say, members of the same social state. To put it clearer, aristocrats like herself, not according to some general rule, say a constitutional system. Among the de facto equals, her thinking is not subject to censorship, and that is why the readings that attribute the nuances and the transformations of Mandeville text to censorship in France do not seem accurate. What this work of youth, unpublished, seems to reveal is rather an Enlightenment universalist position in which enlightenment and rationality explain human nature, its affections and principles of sociability. According to Du Châtelet, reason is not only de facto safeguarded, but should be taken in its universalism as a virtue. Hence, it can be said that she would subscribe to her Détournement, the subtitle as that private virtues, public virtues. Thank you. Oh, it was there. Thank you. This is it.